So I think we can begin. Welcome everybody to our webinar on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, promises and perils. This webinar is a little bit of a prequel to the conference on this very same topic that we're going to be holding in February, on February 10th and 11th here at Harvard Medical School, and we'll be referencing the conference a bit as we discuss some of the issues that feel most alive in this fascinating and rapidly expanding field of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I'm Ron Siegel. I'm a psychologist here on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. I've been involved in a long time in teaching and writing about the interface between mindfulness and compassion practices and psychotherapy. And I'm joined by two other members of the faculty at Harvard Medical School, Jim Hopper, who you see here, who's a consultant at the Outpatient Addiction Services at Cambridge Health Alliance, and is also on the faculty at the medical school, and is also involved as a sub-investigator at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MDMA for PTSD study, as well as Laura Warren, who is a faculty member also at the Cambridge Health Alliance and a mentor in the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion, as well as she joins me on the faculty and the board of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. And in addition to this little cabal from the Harvard area, we're really pleased to be joined as a course co-director by Monica Williams, who's a psychologist and the Canada Research Chair for Mental Health Disparities and the Director of the Laboratory for Culture and Mental Health Disparities, and an Associate Professor at the School of Psychology, all at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And thank you, Monica, so much for joining us here today, as well as for joining us in putting together the conference. So without further ado, I'd like to invite any of you in the audience who have questions as we go along. You'll see there's a Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can just type those questions in there, and I will see them, as well as Karen Cook, who's in the background, who will help to be curating them. So our hope is to be able to address your interests and your questions as we also talk about some of the topics that we thought might be of most interest. And I think we could start right in by discussing a little bit as to, what are the greatest promises right now of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We're also going to deal with the perils because it's important in this day and age, and as these things are evolving so quickly. But I wonder if any of you would like to jump in with what you see as the greatest promise at this moment in time.
I think one of the greatest promises is that with the assistance of these medicines, people can achieve a healing that can be hard to achieve in 50 minutes once a week therapy or more conventional therapy environments, that the medicine combined with a really good container for doing the work can access and speed up people's healing capacities in profound and powerful ways. So that's one of the things that I'm most excited about from the work I've seen and the research that's been coming out.
Yeah, the ways in which they can basically be accelerants for what we're already doing in therapy, but sometimes surprisingly powerful.
Yeah, accelerants and deepening of things that are already happening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I also think.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's okay, Monica. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I also, just want to second that. Looking at the sort of the mental health landscape, there hasn't really been much new for a long time. And as far as, medications and pharmaceuticals, for the most part, those aren't really cures for mental health conditions. Whereas it seems that psychedelics, especially with therapy, actually can, I think, take us to the next level in terms of what we can, offer our clients and patients with mental health concerns that haven't responded by traditional means.
Yeah, and I'll add to that to say that in our current field, there's such a separation between medicine and therapy in many ways. And I think there's also a really neat opportunity, not just to learn more about consciousness, which we all have and can impact so much of our sense of the journey of our lives, which of course connects to mental health and when mental health is not going well, it really matters what the story is too. And so understanding more about how is that created and what are the nuances of how medicine and therapy can work together, I think is really exciting too.
Yeah, and on that point that Monica and Laura, that you're both making, it's also such an interesting paradigm shift, isn't it? That up until now, psychopharmacology has been, at least as I understand it, largely suppressive. It's largely been about how can we dampen the nervous system so that painful experiences aren't so painful. This is dovetailing with what you're just saying, Monica, that, it's not about curing things. It's about basically anesthetizing the pain so that it doesn't hurt so much. And this is really the first time that we're using psychopharmacology for insight, for understanding what has gone awry here in our psyches and doing something to try to create integration and healing. And that's really different. And potentially so useful, because wouldn't it be nice to actually cure things in mental health as opposed to only find ways to make people a bit more comfortable with their suffering?
Exactly.
Yeah. And it shifts the idea, when I was in medical school, I was so amazed by the incredible intricacy of the body. And there's a way that I think in medicine, we're focused on what goes wrong, and the fear. And it also shifts our sense of our relationship with our bodies, that there might be something our nervous system could help us with under the right conditions. And I really love that. It's such a different way of conceiving of one's mind as healthy. It just needs some help being healthy rather than broken, which I think many people experience in the current paradigm.
Yeah, and it's very empowering for people too to have their therapist truly have a deep faith in their ability to heal, their mind and their body's ability to heal on its own. And then with the support of the medicine to access, to kind of get out of some of the ways they're stuck in their thought processes and not really seeing their own potential, to really access that inner healing capacity of themselves is very empowering. It's not there's something wrong with you, how do we suppress these symptoms or whatever. There's a lot right with you and you have incredible ability to heal. And I'm here to support you with that and to provide a safe way for these medicines to facilitate that.
It reminds me of something that Michael Mithofer, who's going to be one of the presenters at our February conference and who is in charge of the MAPS, what I mentioned that the Jim's part of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, their PTSD study, which is the one that's probably furthest along in the FDA approval process. And he said he used to be an emergency room doc before he was a psychiatrist. And he said, when somebody came into the emergency room with a broken arm, I don't know how to cure the broken arm, but I can create the conditions that will allow the arm to heal. I can set the bone and cast it, and then there's the natural propensity of the body to heal. And that is really interesting. One of the things that we see throughout the whole psychedelic assisted psychotherapy world is setting up conditions, using the medicines to facilitate it, but then it's about conditions that allow the psyche, the mind body to heal itself. And that's a very exciting viewpoint. And as Jim was saying, very empowering.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the questions from the audience and we'll go back and forth. And there's a very basic one. I realize that many people are probably not familiar with this. Can we understand how psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is delivered? So I wonder if any of you would like to just explain what some of the models are that are being used these days.
I mean, I can speak to kind of the general principles. There's a model where it goes way back into the 50s and 60s, where there's three basic phases. There's preparation, and then there's what we call medicine sessions. Those are the sessions in which the medicine is used. And then there's integration, where people are supported to integrate what they have accessed in those expanded states of consciousness and embodiment on the medicines. So that's just kind of the overview. You don't just start by giving someone the medicine right away. There's always a phase of preparation. And that can be several sessions of really getting to know the person. And even in the preparation, you're thinking about integration. You're thinking about what are the practices, what are the skills, what are the relationships and supports that are already in this person's life that can be leveraged to help them integrate later. And so those are key aspects. Preparation and integration are always before and after the medicine sessions. And then the actual sessions, they also kind of have those ingredients too. You always start out by, grounding people and what you've agreed on that you're going to do, the boundaries, the rules, the roles of these sessions. And then they enter into the altered state of consciousness, and then they're emerging from that, and you're helping them with integration even within the medicine session. So those are some of the key ingredients. Others, Monica or Laura, you may want to add, but those are some of the key things.
Yeah, I would also add that, it's very different than the way we use medicines today. So it's not like you're going to, go to your CVS pharmacy and get a bottle of 30 pills and take one every day. They're used just a few times, for specific purposes. And then you ideally feel better.
Yeah, and I would add that there's this concept of set and setting. So set refers to mindset, which really is the preparation is part of that, but also people are really asked to, and someone experiencing a session is asked to really think about what are they bringing to the medicine session from themselves. Often it's expressed as an intention. So really asking them to set an intention, something like, may I stay curious, or may I be open to the past parts that are scary to me? Or sometimes people have a sort of a set idea of something that feels pressing that they would like to heal from, or that's top of mind. And then the therapist is aware of that. And the mindset of the participant is really encouraged to be one of curiosity. And so there's a lot of working with this very different sense of the mindset. And then the setting is really the environment. And there's a lot of emphasis on comfort and finding ways to ground oneself, because being in an altered state of consciousness can be very disorienting. It can be scary. All kinds of emotions can come up. And so everything from having ways to discussion of things like touch, which is very different than our traditional approaches to therapy, how to navigate that. And actually that several speakers at the conference will be talking, Jim and several others will be speaking about this idea of trauma-informed approaches, because it can get really tricky. But it's also can be incredibly therapeutic when done in a really nuanced and thoughtful way. So the set and the setting are, participants are often encouraged to bring something from home, or a blanket or something, an object that gives them comfort, different ways of bringing oneself back to a stable place internally. So that's also really different, this concept of set and setting.
Now, in the interest of addressing the interests of you and the audience, we have a little poll. I was saving it a little bit until we had a chance for everybody to arrive. But I wonder if we can share this little poll. And this is just to get an idea of your background in this, both where you're coming from. You'll have to scroll down a little bit. The first question is where you're living and practicing. The second one is your profession. And then the third one is going to be asking about your experience with psychedelics. So if you don't mind taking a moment to vote now, once the results are in, we'll share them with you, and it'll also help to inform us as the conversation goes forward. The topic of our webinar tonight, as well as of the upcoming conference, is promises and perils. So having mentioned a few of the greatest promises, what do you see as the greatest perils? I sometimes, say kiddingly, what could possibly go wrong giving a powerful psychoactive substance to people that can dissolve their entire sense of ego and as well as defenses and repression boundaries. But I thought it might be helpful for us all to share some of the thoughts about what do you worry about most here?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. When we talk about the perils of psychedelics, I think most people are thinking about the physical dangers of the substances themselves, but we know that they're relatively safe and probably safer than what people are already getting from their psychiatrists. So I really see the biggest danger as not having a safe container to experience the psychedelic during a journey and an integration afterwards, because these are powerful tools, and people are very vulnerable when they're in that state, and when there's support and a good container, it's fantastic. But people the psychedelic unravels you somewhat, and the idea is you ravel back up in a good way, but people can be and have been taken advantage of during these experiences, which can have lasting harm.
Yeah, so that's the most egregious example, where when people are in that vulnerable, altered state, that they're actually taken advantage of by a therapist who's crossing boundaries or exploitive in some way. But another thing that we really see is that people are vulnerable, especially people with early childhood trauma and complex PTSD. They're vulnerable to re-experiencing early trauma dynamics, including not just acts of commission, like we were just talking about, but acts of omission, feeling abandoned, neglected, betrayed in certain more subtle ways that can be deeply triggering to people and can really be very harmful to people. So I think there's a danger that people will be all excited about how you can get transformation and everything, but they won't maybe have the training or the supervision or the ongoing support. Or honestly, some of it is just having humility and integrity as a person and as a therapist to acknowledge when you may have gotten caught up in a trauma reenactment with someone, and what contribution you may have made to that. So I think there's a risk that if people aren't really doing good trauma-informed work, that they can get caught up in trauma reenactments, not because they're a bad therapist, not because they're, exploitive towards someone, but just because they didn't have the tools or the support, or maybe some of their own maturity internally to really manage those very powerful trauma dynamics that can happen in any complex trauma therapy, but can get greatly amplified with this work.
And I would add that I think there's still so much research to be done and understanding, like any tool, I have yet to find a tool that, that works for everyone. Everyone is different. And I think, especially for someone who has a history of psychosis, there's a lot of unknowns and big questions around, are there contraindications, absolute contraindications for certain people in terms of, not because of the trauma piece, which is really important, but because of other aspects of how their brain works, that, just like there's certain medicines that don't work, and some of us have allergies, and so I think there's a lot of, that's another piece around just understanding. And with any powerful tool, you also really need wisdom. I think that's the other piece, is that, and it's quite tempting to turn these into a quick fix. And I think that's really it. It's also can be tempting to appropriate in terms of knowledge and wisdom that have come from other cultures, and in many ways, psychedelics have been used in indigenous contexts for a very long time. So I think that's another peril, is lifting things outside of their context, and really gets back to intention, and wisdom. Is there wisdom that's being applied to these incredibly powerful tools?
Another peril that comes to my mind is about, in reference to what you were just saying, is, tools work sometimes for some people and not other times for other people. And there's so much positive press happening lately around psychedelics that people think this is it. This is going to be what can help me where nothing else has. And then if it doesn't, if a person has an experience and it doesn't help, then they start to think, I must really be a hopeless case. And that becomes yet another peril. And that's partly, the fault of everybody who is advertising the promise of this. And it does have great promise, but there's also a peril in assuming that it has perfect and total promise. Let me just pause this for 1 second. So we do have the results of our poll up here. I see most folks are from the state. Hi, 10 people from Canada, Central South America, Europe, Africa, Asia. Thank you, those of you who've come from far. We're really quite evenly distributed among the different mental health professions, with some folks from the medical side and other parts. And I think this is of use for those of us on the panel this evening, which is that only four people in the group have conducted psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. A number have attended trainings. Only a small number have actually experienced it in a psychotherapeutic environment. And about a third of us attending have experienced psychedelics outside of the therapeutic environment, and meaning the formal therapy, and about half of the audience has not had direct experience with it. So thank you so much for sharing that. It is really quite helpful for us to know. And one of the other questions that has come in along these lines, because some of you are quite new to it, there's concrete questions like, how long are these sessions typically? And well, I think that depends on the pharmaceutical that we're using, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I've worked with the MDMA and the MAP study that was referenced before, MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, and those are 8-hour sessions. They start at 9 a.m. and the person takes the medicine around 9:30, 9:45, and they're in a pretty strong effect of the medicine for many hours, like 4 to 5 hours, and then they're coming out of it, but still in an altered state. Whereas for ketamine, those sessions tend to be 3-hour sessions, because when you get the full effect of the ketamine after ingesting it through your mouth, for example, or in an injection, or there's people doing ketamine assisted therapy with infusions, then it's usually about a half hour that you're experiencing that altered state of consciousness. So overall the sessions don't have to be as long, and also it's a lot easier on your body, the ketamine, compared to the MDMA, to have that shorter experience on the medicine that's gentler on your body.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in, and you're making me think, Jim, as you're speaking about the perils question, the sort of promise in perils. And I know one speaker at our conference, Robert Bonazzoli, will be talking about, ketamine can have more of a risk, relatively speaking, around addiction or misuse. And that's often a common question, because there is ketamine misuse that's been documented. And it gets back, I think, to set and setting and sort of context. But he'll be talking at the conference about how to manage addictions in the context of ketamine assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah, and as was mentioned before, around the risk of psychosis, one of Monica's students is going to be speaking about looking into, well, maybe there are ways to safely use psychedelics with people who have psychotic disorders, and they're in the early stages of that work. Maybe Monica wants to say a little bit about that, but why am I forgetting? I remember his name.
Yeah, Joe Latour.
Joe Latour, of course. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and that's sort of been, for a long time, an absolute exclusion. And when we're not even looking at, can it help people with psychotic disorders, but can people who've had a history of even a few psychotic experiences benefit from psychedelics, even for something else? And so there's a lot of different questions that need to be answered. I mean, it doesn't look like it has to be necessarily a strict, if you've ever had a psychotic experience, you can never have these, but it does mean if so, there need to be a lot of supports in place. And again, this is something that does, I think, still require a lot more research, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think there's some promising stuff there.
Quite a few questions are coming in about, what might the delivery of this look like? And we already know something about the delivery of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, because that's happening. And but the other question, and this is something you'll be talking about, Monica, at the conference, is how do we get this out so that it can be accessible to a wide range of people from different backgrounds with different economic resources, different cultural histories, and the like, because so far the field hasn't been doing a great job at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key to getting it out broadly is going to be having basically it be covered by insurers. And and so that's going to, require that we continue to do the research to give it the legitimacy that it needs in order to be perceived as an acceptable and an effective treatment. And also, I know some folks have done some calculations, and even there is a big cost on the front end, with the physical and testing, and then you've got the two therapists with the two therapist model and the long sessions. So these are quite costly interventions, and it is going to be inaccessible to many people unless it's covered. And we know that fully a quarter of the U.S. population is covered by a government type of insurance. And so if we get buy-in at that level, that's going to open it to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think I think what you were about to say, perhaps about the calculations, at least it made me think of, is that some people have tried to figure out, well, if this does actually resolve PTSD, which it does seem to be doing in the current FDA phase 3 trials, that is going to be cheaper than a lifetime of treatments, even though there's a lot of upfront costs involved.
Yes, exactly. I think it saves money in the end. I mean, I don't think money should be our only consideration. I think the person's quality of life is far more important. But if you have somebody who's disabled and getting, constant mental health care to cope with, their condition all their life, versus if you can actually cure them and then they're productive and they're working and they're paying tax and all these other things, well, that's you've gotten your dollars back many times over.
Right. Yeah, a number of questions are coming in that are very kind of nuts and bolts. So maybe we could say a few words about what the different medicines are and where they're at in terms of current use. For example, ketamine assisted psychotherapy. I don't know, Laura, if you'd like to jump in with that one. Sure. What's its status? And you're a psychiatrist, you can prescribe these things.
Sure. Well, so ketamine is an old and quite inexpensive medicine. First, I don't know the exact dates, but first really came about as a battlefield anesthetic. It was seen to be quite safe medically for on the battlefield. So it's, you didn't need to worry as much about respirations going down and having to monitor. So for soldiers who were needing major surgery, ketamine was a very useful medicine. And over time, it's become clear that at different doses, ketamine has different effects. So there's kind of anesthetic dosing, which it's still used a lot for anesthesia in kids and in other realms. And then there's sort of medium and low dosing. And the low dosing doesn't put people all the way into being, anesthetized. And there's sort of two levels in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy of dosing. One is kind of a lower level, and Jim, you can speak to this too, where people are in an altered state, and often therapeutic, there's ways that therapeutic interventions can be received differently because they're in a different space. And then in this sort of medium dosing, often people, and this is being administered in multiple ways. So in the beginning, it started being administered as an IV model, in a really more of a biomedical model based on the cancer infusion model of kind of a biological model of depression, and sort of you get 6 infusions of the ketamine at this low to medium dose. And often people will feel very good it has very immediate anti-suicidal and antidepressant sort of effects. There's still a lot of questions about what long-term ketamine use in this way would mean. And I have a lot of concerns about it, actually. And then as this sort of understanding of psychedelics has come, there's been a different paradigm that's been introduced, this ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which really emphasizes much more of the elements we've been talking about, preparation. It's not about the medicine in an infusion model. It's really about the medicine as part of a much bigger package.
So you're really differentiating between using it as an atypical antidepressant without particular emphasis on therapy versus using it to connect with parts of the heart and mind, shift perspective, and do therapeutic work.
Yes. And I would say currently, most academic medical centers are still, I would say psychiatry itself has been still figuring out how it feels comfortable with ketamine, both in terms of the medical monitoring side, because really many psychiatrists don't have the training that anesthesiologists do. And so there's sort of the biological learning, and then there's really this paradigm shift. And I would say still much ketamine use, at least at many academic centers, is much more in this biomedical model. So that's a whole, there's a number of people in private practice who have background in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy who across the country are trying this other model. But I think one area, it would really be nice if these two worlds were in touch more, and we need more research and really more discussion of these are two very different paradigms. It may be that one paradigm is useful some of the time for certain situations, just like CPR. You wouldn't do CPR on one of your friends if they were just calling you a bad name, but CPR can be very useful as a tool, and so figuring out which paradigm is useful for which situation, and how do the paradigms talk to each other, and how to use sort of to be as preventive as possible and do as minimal harm as possible.
And just for people who are new to learning about this, the ketamine assisted psychotherapy stands out among all of the psychedelic assisted psychotherapies in that while it's off label, it can be prescribed by any licensed physician. So it's actually accessible here and now. We're not having to await FDA approval for people to have access to that. And that's why ketamine assisted that's one of the reasons ketamine assisted psychotherapy has attracted a good deal of attention. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, just in the last couple of days, there was an announcement of a phase 3 trial for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol dependence in the UK. Celia Moore is the principal investigator on that, a very respected pharmacology researcher. Awaken Life Sciences is the private company that is providing some of the funding, but they're actually getting a lot of funding from the National Health Service of the United Kingdom. So this is a new development, literally just in the last couple of days, because ketamine has long been, off patent. It's a cheap medicine, as was said. And then Janssen Pharmaceuticals came up with a variant of ketamine to be administered as a nasal spray for $800 a dose. But that's disconnected from ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, at least as the model has been rolled out. But here we have this phase 3 trial with multiple sites that's going to be starting very soon in the UK for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So that's a very exciting development that's just come out in the last couple of days.
Yeah, and at the conference, Robert Bonazzoli is going to be talking about doing ketamine-assisted work for addictions in particular. Jim, I wonder if you could say something. I mean, the other study that is actually the furthest along you've participated in, which is the MAP study for PTSD. I wonder if you could explain to people what that is and particularly where we're at in terms of the results of that so far.
Yeah, so the MAPS study, it's a phase 3 trial, FDA-approved phase 3 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And we finished collecting data. So it's a phase 3 study, and it had 2 stages to it. And the first stage data was published in March of 2021. And, very strong results of 2/3 of people not having PTSD anymore, 80% having very clinically significant decreases in their PTSD symptoms. And now we've just wrapped up the second part of that study, and that data is being prepared to be submitted to the FDA. So the kind of prognosis on that is if the second phase of it is as strong as the first part of the phase 3 trial, that it could be a legal medicine and a legal therapy in early 2024. So that's really the farthest along in terms of a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy being approved to be used based on, randomized controlled trials. Whereas the ketamine assisted psychotherapy, it's off label and there's no randomized controlled trials of this ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And then there's studies of psilocybin. If I said enough about the MDMA, I can maybe say something about psilocybin.
Sure.
Yeah. So the next wave with psilocybin is for alcohol use disorder, and it's a multi-site trial that's, again, going to be starting up very soon. And that, the phase 2 data looked very promising. And then I think it's 2 psilocybin sessions they're giving people. And psilocybin, as we were saying before, MDMA are 8-hour sessions, ketamine 3, psilocybin sessions are also all-day sessions in these protocols. So that is a phase 3 study that is getting started, and it'll be a couple years. And then there's, of course, the psilocybin for depression studies, by Compass Pathways, and I think USONA's got one going, right? Maybe Monica you might know more about those studies. You want to chime in on the psilocybin for depression, which is kind of in between the MAPS and the substance psilocybin study.
Yeah, I mean, actually, interestingly, in Canada, for the first time, the federal funding agencies put out a call for psilocybin assisted therapy for end of life, distress, substance use, and depression. They're going to give 3 $1 million grants out to the lucky winners, and I see this really as a kind of a huge turning point in terms of the priorities, of these research funding agencies and the government.
Yeah. Well, and psilocybin for end of life issues is, while it's not far along in terms of FDA staging, there have been a lot of research, a lot of studies out of NYU looking at this in the palliative care context, and at the Aquilino Cancer Center, which is affiliated with Johns Hopkins, which is another big psychedelic assisted therapy study center, where they're developing a group therapy model for people with advanced cancer diagnoses. So that proves particularly interesting because it touches on something that has spread across the realm of the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which is that there seem to be strong correlations between clinical improvement and people having what are called mystical or transpersonal experiences. And this is of particular interest to me, having been in the contemplative practices world for a long time, because this is basically forms of what we might think of as spiritual awakening, no longer seeing oneself as a separate self, but seeing oneself as part of the larger ecosystem, part of the web of life, part of the human family. And I wonder if, and that seems to be predictive of therapeutic change. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what is it about that makes it predictive of therapeutic change? Why would this be so important across the board?
Well, one thing I would say is on the end of life issues, where that can be a very transformative thing. If you're facing death and then you have this experience of unity, or this possibility that in some way life goes on, or your consciousness goes on, or people have many different experiences. We do have someone who's been working with these medicines and is doing research, Yvon Bassant. He's going to be presenting at the conference about work he's doing with end of life issues. One caveat or one qualification I would give is in the MDMA for PTSD research, they've actually looked at mystical experience and measure those, and those are not correlated with the outcomes in the PTSD study. And, our understanding of that, we need to study it more, but is that in the MDMA, people tend to be in their body. Some people have mystical experiences, but it's very much an experience of safe, loving, wise embodiment and being able to work through and face the most painful, shameful things that you've experienced. And so it seems more of working in the level of the personal narrative and story. And it can be very beautiful and spiritual in some ways, but in terms of mystical experience, that's actually not correlated with outcome in the MDMA study. But certainly in the psilocybin studies, that's been what people have been finding.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And it, from a perspective of, the mindfulness community and Buddhist psychology, we talk about wisdom and compassion being two wings of a bird, both being necessary. And it would seem that what's happening in the MDMA work with PTSD is a real upwelling of the compassion side of it toward oneself and toward others. And I know Bessel van der Kolk, who's also going to be at the conference, has reported on, out of the study that you've been involved with, Jim, that interestingly, self-compassion scores have gone up a lot in people studying with PTSD, and this seems to correspond also to clinical improvement, that somehow people are able to hold and love themselves, which is, not it goes hand in hand with mystical experience in other psychological investigations and realms.
And it's a real embodied wisdom, I would say, with the MDMA too. There's a lot of compassion, but it's a profound embodied wisdom that people access as well. Yeah.
And I also think that part of the exciting aspects of this field, no matter, I think it's relevant for all of us who work in any kind of mental health field, because I think the paradigm shift is enough that what we learn about these questions, to some degree, we're asking the question, well, what is healing? Is healing a mystical experience? Maybe it is for one person. Is healing, really a lot of self-compassion? Maybe it is. And so up until this point, I feel like the question has really been, what is not healing? How do we get rid of that? And this is really a different layer of looking at what is healing. And I just love it that we don't know, but it's a new way of looking at the process of that.
Quite a number of questions are coming in on the level of, how do I get trained in this? And we're still at a relatively early point in the evolution of the field. Not to be self-serving to our little project here, but one way to get trained in this is start attending conferences where people who are on the cutting edge of doing this work are explaining where they're at and where the work's at. So that's one place to start. There are also year-long training programs. There's one out of Naropa, there's one out of the California Institute for Integral Studies about that really look at this from quite a number of angles. But it remains a bit of an open question because, again, there's ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which is legal, and there are some groups training therapists in that. But most of this is still in the research phase in terms of accessing it legally. So it's time for us to start educating ourselves, in part because we're also, many of us, and maybe we have time for this last moment, this last question, which is, what do you do with clients who are experimenting on their own? Because this is one of the reasons why all of us could use some training in this, because a lot of clients are experimenting on their own and they come to therapy reporting on their experience. And we have some responsibility for saying and doing something useful, I think.
That's a lot for a short amount of time we have left, but
Yeah,
I do want to highlight one of our speakers, Elizabeth Nielsen, who is one of the founders and a leading training person with an organization called Fluence. And so she's been working with MAPS, and they have a harm reduction focus, as well as a really nice model of training and working with integration. And so she'll be talking about that at the conference. So, and harm reduction is also when people are coming to you telling you that they're using these substances, or, hey, I'm going to go to this ayahuasca ceremony tomorrow, or I'm going to do this or that with a shaman or guide or something. And so harm reduction is a really key principle. And, it comes from the addictions world originally, but Elizabeth and some of her colleagues have done some really rigorous work about thinking about, really good models of harm reduction and how to integrate them into the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy that we can do as therapists, but also when people are coming to us and using these medicines, and how to, educate them, inform them, help them reduce their risks. Maybe Monica or Laura want to say more about that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, I got to say, I'm really excited because I taught a graduate class this semester called psychedelic therapies for mental health. And, this was like the first time this course has ever been taught. It's a new course. It's actually in the catalog. It wasn't a special seminar. And that was a big piece of what we were teaching, because we had a lot of psychology students in the class who some of them who had never even didn't know anything about psychedelics, but increasingly recognizing that clients are coming to us saying, hey, I've had a psychedelic experience. Can you help me? Right.
And that is certainly what, go ahead, Laura.
I would just chime in that it's sort of, it's going to happen to you if you're a clinician sooner or later. And I think, going back to Jim's point and echoing Monica, I think knowing what harm reduction is and having some strategies of how to approach that, and also really having some sense of trauma-informed care, and also some awareness of the promises and perils, because people will be maybe telling you about situations, and having some sense of, wow, was there enough of a container, and being able to kind of raise that as just in the same way you would raise it with someone who's telling you about other things they're doing that you're trying to assess, is this helping or harming you? I think really having some sense of what's out there in the clinical world is really key.
Yeah. So I want to thank all of you for coming to attend. I want to be respectful of your time and realize that we said we were going to end at the end of the hour where we've arrived. I want to thank my fellow course directors for all your contributions here, as well as Nancy Felsheim and Karen Cook, who you're not seeing, but who are behind the scenes doing the administration, for making this course come to fruition. And I'm hoping we get to see a number of you in February. The course is going to be both live in the Boston area. Really nice. We have a long history of these Harvard Medical School courses here, and they're wonderful opportunities to meet in person with colleagues usually from all over the world. But there will also be the streaming option for those of you for whom traveling to Boston would be difficult, or there are other reasons why you rather attend virtually. That'll also be possible. And as you can see, we're just scratching the surface. This is a vast field. It's really complicated. The world of psychotherapy is really complicated, and doing it well is important, and bad therapy is really problematic. Well, this world is equally complicated, and doing it well is really important. And when it's not done well, it can be even more harmful. So I applaud those of you who came to attend, and I hope this has been useful, and I hope you continue learning along with us in February. Thanks so much for being here.